Good morning and welcome to another online Sunday school class with Tunnel Hill Baptist Church. As always, we like to begin by reminding you that we here at Tunnel Hill Baptist Church believe that Jesus is the Christ, that he's the Son of the living God who lived a perfect life and died a sacrificial death for your sins and for mine, and rose from the grave 3 days later to give us new life in him. If you'd like more information about what it means to make Jesus Christ your Lord and Savior, we would invite you to follow the link in the description. It will take you to a full gospel presentation. It'll also show you how to respond to the gospel and how to connect with Tunnel Hill Baptist Church. If you live in the Hardin County, Kentucky area, we would love for you to join us for worship at 11 o'clock on Sundays right here at Tunnel Hill Baptist Church, or you can watch us online through Facebook Live. If you do not live in the Hardin County, Kentucky area, we still want to connect with you because we want to help you find a Bible-believing church where you do live. We are beginning a new study this week, so we're going to be starting off in session 1, and it is titled Seen and Heard. And we're going to be looking at the books of Exodus and Leviticus as we go through this study. So again, this is session 1, titled Seen and Heard, and we're going to be looking at Exodus chapter 2, verses 23 through 25, and chapter 3, verses 7 through 15. And I want you to think for just a moment as we start off in our study today about some names that were maybe really popular that you don't hear anymore. And so think of a name that maybe was very common when you were growing up. Maybe think about back to your days in elementary school or high school, that your classmates, what were some names that were very popular that seemed very normal and very common when you were a young person, and now you just don't hear very much about it? And think of those names, and I want you to answer this question. It says, what causes a name to become popular for a while, and what causes a name to fall out of favor? And this is going to relate to our study a little bit here in a little bit. So here's what we want you to do is we ask questions throughout our study. We want to encourage you to pause the video and actually take some time to respond to those questions. And so if you're by yourself, get a pen, paper, write some things down, take some notes, maybe start like a notebook or a journal to kind of go through this study. Or if you're watching this with family, to watch it and have those discussions. And then in both cases, whenever you're ready, just hit play again. So again, those question is this. It says, what name was popular a generation ago that you never hear anymore? And what are some names that have become popular what are causes that make a name become popular and to fall out of favor? Take a couple minutes and discuss that, and then we'll get rolling in our study. All right, so hopefully you thought of some names, maybe like I said, some names from that you grew up with that seemed very common at the time, that you don't see very much now. The book actually points this out. It says that in the 1980s, the most popular baby names were Jessica, Jennifer, Amanda, Ashley, Sarah, Michael, Christopher, Matthew, Joshua, and David, which I thought that was interesting, having been born in the 80s as my sister as well, and my sister's name is Jessica and my name is Joshua. Both fall into that. The most popular names in the 2010s were Emma, Olivia, Sophia, Isabella, Ava, Noah, Liam, Jacob, William, and Mason. And what's interesting, in just about 30 years' time, there's absolutely no overlap between those most popular names. And you may look at a lot of different reasons why that could be. I think sometimes it's because of famous actors or famous people that share those names. Sometimes it is book characters and or movie characters or things like that. And then just, over time, they get associated with that something that, I wouldn't name my kid that because that's what my parents were named, or that's what my teachers were named, and all that type of stuff. I know with my wife, I hate to say it, but even when we were having discussions about what to name our kids, we would throw out some of our names, and my wife would be like, well, I had a student name that, and I probably wouldn't want to name my kid that because it would make me think of a certain student. There's all sorts of different reasons why one might fall in favor or out of favor. What is important to know is that God knows our names no matter what. And he is also aware of every difficulty that we face and is willing to lead us through them. In today's study, we will demonstrate how God sees the plight of his people and that he has a plan for helping us. In some cases, we are the ones called to help. Other times, we're the ones receiving the help. Either way, God cares, and we can be sure that He sees the plight of His people. So that's where we're really jumping into this week. We are starting off in the book of Exodus. Now, the book of the title of the book of Exodus comes from the Greek kind of translation of this book. And in early Jewish tradition, these books really didn't have the first 5 books of the Bible really did not have major distinctions. They were just the books of Moses. They were they were called the law, those type of things. In fact, I have another translation of the Bible where they're just called the first book of Moses, the second book of Moses, the third book of Moses, and so on. And so these kind of titles actually come from that Greek translation of the New Testament, or excuse me, of the Old Testament, which is really what like Jesus would have been familiar with, having grown up in kind of a more Greek culture. It was called the Septuagint, was the name of that translation. And that's where it gets the name Exodus, which comes from the Greek word to exit or to leave. And so this second book of Moses is the book of Exodus, which all revolves around God delivering His people from Egypt, or God allowing Israel to leave, to exit Egypt. And so when we jump into our passage today, we're going to kind of begin to see the beginning of that and what is happening. And we're going to actually pick up in Exodus chapter 2, starting in verse 23. And we're going to just read verses 23 to 25 to get us started. And as we do so, I want you to listen for how God saw the plight of His people. So beginning in chapter 2, we're going to start in verse 23 and read through to verse 25. It says this: After a long time, the king of Egypt died. The Israelites groaned because of their difficult labor, and they cried out. Their cry for help because of the difficult labor ascended to God. And God heard their groanings, and God remembered His covenant with Abraham and Isaac and with Jacob. And God saw the Israelites, and God knew. This is such an interesting statement, and we have just so much here. And we were, asked at the beginning to listen for how God saw the plight of His people, and we see in here that it makes these very clear statements that God saw it, that God knew about it, that their prayers and their ask for help and deliverance had risen up to God, and because of that, God remembered His covenant. That does lead the book to kind of ask this question to kind of start things off and to get us thinking. It's, which is harder, physical or emotional distress, and why? And so I would encourage you, pause the video, answer that question. For you, this is kind of an opinion question. Which is harder, physical stress or physical distress, or is emotional distress harder? And why would you say that? I don't think there's a wrong answer here, but I'd love to hear what your thoughts are on this. So go ahead and pause the video, answer that question, and then we'll keep going in our study. All right, so we have this question of like, which is harder, physical and emotional stress? And I don't think there's a wrong answer. I think physical stress can sometimes seem really hard, especially when you're at that point of failure where your body's ready to give out. When you're kind of experiencing that physical failure, you might say to yourself, like, this is the worst. But I think emotional distress can be really hard too, because a lot of times with emotional distress, there doesn't seem to be an end of it. Eventually with physical stress, either your body gives out or you get sick or you finish the job, whatever's causing the distress. But a lot of times with emotional distress is you feel like it's never going to end, that it seems like it's just going to be something that is there, that is a reality from the beginning all the way until end of life, and it's never going to end. And so both of them can kind of give us that feeling of helplessness, of being overwhelmed, of pain or sorrow or whatever it might be. And so it's really hard to say which one would be worse. And I think it might just depend on the person, and probably even depend on which distress they maybe have been through most recently. And what we see in Israel in this time is there's really both. There's both that physical distress where they are being called to work, they're slaves, they're making bricks, they've got this horrible job, but then there's the emotional distress of the abuse and being mistreated and being driven by the Egyptians, and there being no end to it. There's nothing that's going to change their life, and so they are continuing to sink down into a pit of hopelessness And in the midst of this, they are crying out to God to deliverance. Now, it's important to note that we get a lot of kind of human characteristics in God here that to kind of help us understand what's happening. When we look at here, we see how God heard, how he remembered, how he saw, and how he knew. And all of these things are there not necessarily to say that God has eyes and ears and all of these, in a brain and all that type of stuff, but rather to say that God was empathizing, God was understanding what was going on. And literally that last word there, that he knew, was really kind of significant. In fact, really, if we contrast this to, say, the idols of Egypt, God was not stone and gold and all of these other silver and all these other things that Egypt made idols of, but this was a God who was alive, that he could hear them, he could see them, he remembered things, he knew things. He was a caring God that listened to his people. There's a huge contrast going on here between the Egyptian gods, which were often aloof, that were seen as these stone statues and whatnot, and the God of Israel, who cared and knew and heard and saw the plight of his people. The book asks this question. It says, why do some people think God is aloof and unaffected by human suffering? And how do these verses stand in opposition to that kind of thinking? This is a great question for us to think about. When we look at these verses here, how does this stand in opposition to the idea that God is aloof, that he is far away, that he is disinterested? And if this is what we have in Scripture, why do people think that way? Take a couple minutes, pause the video, discuss that, and then we'll move along in our study. All right. So when we think about why someone might think God is aloof and not concerned about this world and about us, and sometimes it might be because of delay, because we don't get that kind of quick answer that we think we're going to get or that we really want from God. We only get this like very short, or we want like immediate results, and sometimes we don't get that, and sometimes God doesn't move on our timetable or in the exact way we want, and so we assume that God is disinterested. I think also we have a hard time comprehending what it means to have this perfect, good, holy, infinite God, and because of that, we struggle to understand that. We think that God's busy doing other things because we put him in a very finite thing. But our scripture today points to a very different thing, that God does hear, he sees, he remembers, he cares about his people. And I think that extends to even today and into creation today. And he especially cares for those who have placed their faith in him through Christ Jesus. The book says it this way. It says, sometimes God delays his actions, but he always follows his plan. And sometimes he acts alone, but also uses people. Moses was one of the people that God used for his purposes. And that's where we're going to dive into next. So we're going to kind of turn the page here and go to Exodus chapter 3. And we're going to start off by reading verses 7 through 10. And as I read verses 7 through 10, I want to encourage you to listen for God's promise and for his plan. So let's dive into our text this morning. It says this. Then the Lord said, this is God talking to Moses, I have observed the misery of my people in Egypt and have heard them crying out because of their oppressors. I know about their sufferings, and I have come down to rescue them from the power of the Egyptians and to bring them from that land to a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey, the territory of the Canaanites, the Hethites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. So, because the Israelites' cry for help has come to me, I have also seen the way the Egyptians are oppressing them. Therefore, I am sending you to Pharaoh so that you may lead my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. Okay, so we get this idea of this is the plan, this is the goal, or what it asks. This is the promise, and this is the plan. And so the promise was that he was going to deliver Israel and bring them into the promised land, bring them into this spacious land, this land of milk and honey, that he was going to give them the land of the Canaanites and all the people that lived there. There's a reason for that. Their sin had become so gross and so bad that this was going to be a judgment upon them for their sin and their idolatry, and he was going to give this land to his people, to the Israelites. And he says, okay, this is the promise. This is what I'm going to do. Here's the plan. The plan is you are going to go get them. I am going to send you. By this point, Moses is living in another place. He's kind of away from Egypt and away from all that. He says, you're going to go back, you're going to get my people, and you're going to bring them to that land. That is the plan. This is the question the book asks and wants you to answer. It says, how do you think Moses felt about what God said in verse 7 and 8? And how do you think he felt when he heard what God said in verse 10? Now, 7 and 8 was the promise of what he had heard, and what happened in verse 10. It says, therefore I am sending you. So take a couple of minutes to discuss that. What do you think Moses thought when he was hearing about the promise, and what did you think when he said what the plan was? Take a couple of minutes to discuss that, and then we'll keep going in our study. All right, so I can see this being one of those things where he's telling the plan. He says, "I've heard the suffering. I've seen what's been going on. I've observed their misery. I'm going to rescue them. I'm going to take care of them. I'm going to set things better." And I can see you going, "Oh, that's great, God. That's wonderful news. That's exactly what they need. That's going to be such a good thing. Like they're going to be so excited. They're going to worship you. This is going to be great." And then it gets to that point. He goes, "And I'm sending you to bring them out," and him going, "Excuse me, no, that's not my gifting. That's not my calling." I think so often about in church, and this doesn't necessarily happen here at Tuttle Hill, but it's kind of an old trope, if you will, or an old kind of stereotype where people say, "Pastor, we really need this. We really need this ministry or that ministry. We really need to do this benevolence thing or whatnot." And then when the pastor goes, "Okay, how do you want to start it? When do you want to start? Who do you want your team to be?" They go, "Oh, no, not me. I'm not feeling called to do that. I don't think that's not my gifting. I'm not being asked to lead that. I just think the church should do that." I could totally see that being kind of Moses mentality. Yes, God, that's wonderful. Yes, it's been so hard for them. Yes, you should deliver them. That's great that you're going to take them to this wonderful land. Wait, I'm sorry. What? You want me to do it? No, God. You don't want me to do it. That's not my gifting. And the reality is that's the opposite is true for Moses. This is perfectly his gifting. He has been trained up in the Egyptian court. He knows what it means to be royalty there. He probably knows some of the people. He knows how to speak to them, how to behave. He is obviously a Jewish person. He has already shown care and concern for justice and for doing what is right, for stepping in to protect the people that need protecting. He did that when that one was being beaten by the Egyptian. He did it to save his wife from some of the other shepherds. He was the perfect man to do it. He just didn't see it. And so he undoubtedly, and we're going to see this very soon, he resists that fact. The book does ask this question. It says, in what ways has God used your past experience to prepare you for a later opportunity or assignment? And that's a really great question to think about, is how has God used your previous experience and the things you've gone to help in doing ministry and to serving other people today? In fact, why don't we take a couple minutes? Why don't you take some time and think about that, discuss that, how God has used your past experiences to help you or to prepare you to serve today. Take a couple minutes, think about that, and then we'll keep going in our study. All right, so hopefully you have that. A lot of times people will sometimes it's the bad things of their past that help them. Maybe it was the dad who had an absent father who steps up and decides to be the best dad he can be. Maybe it's the opposite. Maybe you had a great father, and so you have this awesome example to then carry on to your kids about what it means to walk with the Lord. Maybe you've had experiences and trials and temptations in your life that help you to better disciple and care for people elsewhere. Maybe because of a job or because of a high school club, something like that. You got very comfortable speaking in front of people or serving behind the scenes, and that has enabled you to be a great servant in the church and even outside of the church today. Maybe you experienced some hardship when you were younger, and that hardship has made you much more empathetic and caring towards people today. There's 1,000 ways that your past experiences can really help you in serving the Lord today, and that's all how God is moving and God is working. In this particular case, we see how Moses was essentially voluntold that what he was going to do and how he was going to help people. And even though he's going to try to make excuses for why he shouldn't be the one to do that, we're going to see very quickly that none of those excuses hold and that God is going to be with him. The book says it this way. It says, we may get away with declining an opportunity from another person, but saying no to God is just a different story. Let's keep going in our reading of this passage. We're going to read verses 11 and 12. And as we do so, we're just going to kind of be looking at how Moses responds to God's word and how God responds to Moses' questions. Picking up in verse 11, we read this. Moses asked God, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and that I should bring the Israelites out of Egypt? And God answered, he said, I will certainly be with you, and this will be a sign to you that I am the one who sent you when you bring the people out of Egypt. You will all worship God at this mountain. And so we get this very clear thing where Moses is saying, like, who am I? And there's a bit of humility here, but it's really more of a, not a who am I, like, oh, I'm a nobody, God, but it's why me? Why are you picking me to do this? I'm removed from that. I'm a shepherd up here in this mountainous area. Why me? Why do you want me to be the one that goes and delivers them out of Egypt? Why me? And God responds, he says, listen, I'm going to be with you. You're not going to do this on your own. It's not like I'm giving you this seemingly impossible task and then expecting you to just figure it out. I am going to do it with you. I will be with you. And this is going to be the sign of that. When all is said and done, you'll come back and you'll bring the people to this very mountain that we're on and you'll worship me. And this is going to be a major event in the book of Exodus of when they finally get to that mountain to worship God. The book asks this question. It says, if you were Moses, how do you think you would have addressed God? And what would you be feeling? And so we can kind of answer that one together. And I just tell you, for me personally, I would be, first and foremost, I would be scared to death. I would be nervous and scared to the point of anxiety. I would be shaking. I would be thinking about all of the things that might happen if I go before Pharaoh and tell him to release his entire slave population. I would be thinking to that, and I could tell you, like, my entire insides would be shaking. I would be so nervous and so scared of what God has asked me to do. Now, how I would respond, I'm not convinced I would respond much different than Moses did, where I would say, why me? There's other people, there's more qualified people, there's better speakers, there's more important pastors out there, there's other people out there that can do that job 1,000 times better than me. Why on earth, God, would you want me to do that? And it would be scary. Like, I think I would be scared. And even then I'd be saying, like, okay, am I crazy? Am I having an event? Am I separating from reality? Is something happening that I'm imagining all of this? But all of it would be based on fear. I would be scared. I'm curious if you would be different, but I know for me, there would not be this like, yes, Lord, I'm there. I would be scared to death. And that would be something that really affected me. There's two things which, if we think about Moses, I think we can think of a lot of things that might make him feel inadequate. In fact, we can go through the text and he'll point out some of those things. For me, he's kind of a wanted criminal. He's been out of, what I would say is he's been out of the game or out of that culture for years by this point. So, Pharaoh has changed, things have changed. He is last remembered as having killed and rised up and killed an Egyptian, and the Jewish people were kind of talking that, throwing that back in his face. There'd be all of these things that would make him say, like, if I go back, what if I get caught? What if I get arrested? What if the people reject me? There'd be 1,000 what ifs based on who he is, but all of that is answered in the question, I will be with you. And that's something that's important for us to remember, that every problem, everything that is connected to his what ifs is God saying, I will be with you. And when all is said and done, you will come here and you will worship me. The book does ask this question. It says, can you think of a time when you knew God was certainly with you? And how did that experience help solidify your faith? Take a couple minutes, pause the video to discuss that. Can you think of that time where you knew God was with you and how that really shored up your faith? Take a minute, discuss that, and then we'll keep rolling in our study. All right, so hopefully you have one of those times. I tell you what, I'm going to use an example that I've probably used before. But many years ago, about 8 years ago, I got the opportunity to start doing some ministry and to start serving and kind of trying to just serve the people and the students over at ECTC at our local community college. And I remember kind of starting those conversations, and I had a couple meetings and ended up meeting with a group of staff and teachers and faculty that would have kind of a regular prayer meeting. And then I was kind of telling them who I was and what, generally speaking, was my vision for doing ministry at ECTC. And I remember one of the people kind of finally saying, listen, we've been praying for you for like years now, that somebody would care about our kids enough to come on campus and to try to reach them and try to share the good news with them and try to, just have a Bible study and disciple them. And I remember in that moment thinking, oh wow, God has been at work in this and for this well before I even realized it. And that was just one of those times where I just knew that God was in it. I knew that God was with me and what we were trying to accomplish. And I just remember being like so encouraged and strengthened. Like it said, my faith was solidified, but also humbled, and knowing that I kind of thought like, okay, I'm going to do this and I'm going to do that, and I'm going to do this. And I realized that God was doing so much more before I even knew that this was something God was calling me to do. And that now I was just now coming into the work that God had already been doing on that campus through these people and just through his spirit moving. And it was such an empowering thing, but also such a humbling thing. And that was definitely a time where I realized God was with me, and it really strengthened my faith. Let's see how our story plays out. We're going to read the last few verses of our passage today. We're going to look at verses 13 through 15. And as we do that, I want you to kind of look at the things that are said, identify those phrases that would indicate Moses' level of confidence versus God's confidence. This is an interesting way to put that, but let's think through this a little bit. So we're picking up in verse 13, and it says this: Then Moses asked God, if I go to the Israelites and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they ask me, what is his name? What should I tell them? God replied to Moses, I am who I am. This is what you are to say to the Israelites. I am has sent me to you. God also said to Moses, say this to the Israelites, the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob has sent me to you. This is my name forever. This is how I'm to be remembered in every generation. So when we think about kind of the level of confidence here, I would put, if we were to put that on a scale of 1 to 10, God's confidence is obviously a 10. He knows who he is. He is the unchanging one. He is the M that I am. He is not like, nothing is changing with him. There's no faltering. There's no wavering. There's no flickering. He is. God is. And in light of all of that, because God is, he knows that this is what's going to happen, and he knows what to tell them, and he knows who he is. But Moses, not so much. He's saying, okay, here's our first what if. What if I go to them and I tell them, the God of your ancestors, that God has sent me to you to deliver you from Egypt, and they ask me what your name is? What do I say? How do I show them that this is real and that I'm not just a crazy person? So his confidence is what, maybe a 3? Like he's at that point now where he's saying, okay, I'll do it. Like he's saying, if I do it. So he's kind of he's past no way. And he's kind of like, if I do this, what happens now? Or what happens now? And so that's where he's at. And so not confident at all. Maybe a 3, maybe a 4, maybe less than that. And God, again, reaffirms like, listen, I am that I am. This is what you'll say, and really gives these powerful statements relating to who God is that should that should work with the people, especially the elders who have put the time and the thought into their covenant relationship with God. The book does ask this question. It says, what does God's name reveal about his nature? And I've said a little bit about that, but let's expand upon that a little bit. What do you think when you look at him saying that he is the I am who I am? You'll say to the Israelites that I am has sent you, and that he's the God of the Israelites, the God of your fathers, of Abraham and of Isaac and of Jacob, that he is the Lord, Yahweh. What do you think that communicates about his nature? Take a couple minutes to discuss that, and then we'll start to close out our study. All right. So one of the things the book points out about this is that God exists in his own power, that God is not dependent on anybody, that he is not contingent on anything, that he's not affected by the weather or anything under the sun, that he is who he is, that he is the unchanging one. In fact, the book even points out that the way it's worded is not only the I am that I am, but the I am that I will be what I will be. And it's that idea that's saying like he's not changing at all. I am even what I will be. You could move it all around, and the idea that's saying that God is the unchanging one, we call it the unmoved mover in some apologetic groups and all that type of stuff, and that because of that they could trust him, and that they could understand that even the promises that he had made to Abraham are the same promises on which he is standing today. And even in all this statement about that he's remembered them and all that is just saying that he is now going into action to fulfill those promises. It would have been important to the Israelites to understand that Moses brought words from God and brought this purpose. Before Moses could confront Pharaoh and lead the Hebrews, his own faith had to be tested and grounded in a personal relationship with God. And I want you to understand that we are no different. And that's really one of the important things to understand from this is as we have all this happening and we have this call of God and all of these fantastic things, we want to understand that all of this starts with Moses finally saying, I trust God. I am putting my faith in the God of Israel, and I'm going to trust him. And because I trust him, I'm going to be obedient to him. And the same is true for us. It has to start with, I believe in God. I believe that his son is Jesus Christ, and I am putting my faith and trust in him. And because I've put my faith and trust in him, I am going to follow him. What I want to do to close out our time together is I want us to close out our time in prayer. And I want us to really look at Exodus chapter 3, verse 12. And I want this to be what I would call the fuel for our prayer time. And I want to read this to you again. It says this, God, he says, he answered, this is God, I will certainly be with you. And this will be my sign to you, that I am the one who sent you. When you bring the people out of Egypt, you will all worship God at this mountain. And I want you to think about what God is saying here and how this might affect us, and really let that fuel us. I want us to recognize that God will be with us, that God will certainly be with us, that he will take us through all those things. And then even maybe the end result will be that idea of worship and celebration of all that God has done. The book says this, it says, spend some time praying through the scriptures using Exodus 3:12. And as you read this, I want you to answer these two questions as you say your prayer to God. Number one, how does God reveal himself in this verse? And number two, how should I respond to what he says? And that's what I want to do for us to close out our time. I want you, as we close out our time today, I want you to read Exodus 3:12 again. And I want you to pray over this verse asking, how does God reveal himself? Talk to God. God, this is how I think you reveal yourself to me in this passage, and this is how I'm going to respond to that. This is how what I want to do. And I would encourage you, make sure that idea of worship is a part of that thing. And so this is what we want to do. Read 3:12, close your time in prayer, reflecting on that verse, and then I want to invite you to join us for worship right here at 11 o'clock. Both in person and online. We have a special speaker today. One of our missionaries from Brazil is going to be joining us today and giving us a word from Brazil and encouragement as we begin our Lottie Moon Christmas offering. Thank you again for joining us today. God bless.